thank you very much for this opportunity to present my work. Before starting, I first want to thank all my smart colleagues and sponsors that have supported this work, in particular Vista and GeoX, who's funded a fellowship, and CGG for providing the data. So I think this will fit in really nicely with the two previous talks, in that it adds basically the third dimension. So we will use seismic data to basically look down into the crust and see if we can identify some of the structures, some of the fault systems that are growing. And we will use data from the North Sea and apply new machine learning methods to really map the fault network in 3 dimensions. So start off. Yes, this will be the structure of my talk. I will give a brief introduction. This will probably bore most of you, but just to get everybody on board, then talk about deep learning of seismic reflection data and how we can apply it to normal fault systems, and at the end, a analysis of these fault systems. So if we think about normal fault systems and rifts, there are basically 2 main branches why you would do this. On the one side, the seismic hazards, and that we want to understand the distribution of earthquakes, and existing faults impose strong control on where these earthquakes occur. So we want to map them as accurately as possible, like in this example in East Africa. And the second motivation is natural resources, in particular hydrocarbons, like you can see here from the continental shelf of Norway, where you have a close correlation between faults and hydrocarbon accumulations. So for both, we need to understand where these faults are and how they evolved. To do this, we can use machine learning. So I'll give a really brief introduction into this new branch of machine learning called deep learning. What it does is basically, it's a model that knows how to cluster data. So what you can see here on the right-hand side, for instance, is a distribution of data with in 2 dimensions, and you have these clusters that you would like to identify with the model. So the data points are plotted here, and then the model is the underlying color. When you train the model, which looks a bit like this, a series of convolutions that are connected, you basically fit the underlying functions to this distribution of points, with the objective that you can classify new points that you will add to this distribution. So in really real terms speaking, if we have a seismic data set and we label some faults in them, we can use these faults to train a model to predict even more faults in the rest of the data. How it actually works is you have an optimization process by which you calculate the misfit between the given data and the predicted one, and you want to minimize this by adjusting the internal model weights. When we apply this to our data, and our data is one of the largest seismic data sets ever recorded offshore Norway, we typically do this by labeling a part of our data, then splitting this labeled data into a set for training and validation. So by validation, we check how good our training is. We fit the model, check if the accuracy is high enough, and if it is, hopefully, then we can apply it to the rest of the data. Yes, so let's see how this looks. If we label our data, it would look like this. This is a seismic section east-west across the North Sea rift, where we can look down to 15 kilometers, even deeper. And we manually label faults like this. So we give it label 1 if there's a fault, and label 0 if there's none. And then we split this one up into lots of little windows that we can feed to the algorithm, because we want to increase the number of examples. So if we just use these sections, I labeled about 22 of 22,000, and this took already a long time. This won't be enough. So these algorithms need a large amount of training data. So that's why we split up this data set to get more examples out of it. The training results you can plot in these called learning curves that basically track how well the training works. So ideally, you want to reduce the loss, so this one here, over time. You can do this, you can test it on the training data set and the validation. The validation is the important one. This is data the algorithm hasn't seen before training, so you can make sure you have an independent constraint on how well it does. So you see it decreases, but this later on effect that it increases again is if our model overfits the data. So it basically remembers the data without learning the pattern. We want to avoid this, so we stop the training at an earlier point. These epochs refer to each cycle that the model has seen all the data. So the training, you can track the training like this, and you can visualize the result in something called the confusion matrix, where you show how well it predicts the true labels. So yes, so it's very good at predicting where no faults are. Predicting the faults is a bit trickier, mainly because there's a strong class imbalance. So there are many more data points with no faults than there are faults, which makes it hard for the algorithm to pick up the faults. If you want to learn more about this on all the technical details and even try it out yourself, we have tutorials, a paper, a preprint, and a poster. So you can get to work. Yes, the results then look something like this. So we have our input seismic data and then the prediction of the faults on a seismic line that it hasn't seen before. And you can see that it nicely picks up some of these larger faults in here, and even the more subtle ones in here. There are also some misclassifications, layers here, so it's not perfect. And in particular, we lose resolution with depth, just like in the seismic data. So the algorithm cannot predict anything that's not in the original data. The interesting point comes now when we apply this across the whole data set. So I've done this. And this was the point that was exciting to see if we actually map consistently these faults. So what you see here is a depth slice that goes down through the data set and slices this large seismic volume at different depths. And so each seismic lines you saw previously basically correspond to sections, and if you stack them up, you get this this image on the predictions. So you can already see that we pick up some of the faults. If we look at this in more detail at different depths, for instance, 2 kilometers, 3 or 4, you can see nicely that we map consistent structures throughout the data set. Yes, and there's a lot of complexity. So we really image this in 3D. You also have some noise, but it's really nice. And you can see this in particular if you compare it to the previous fault map used by the Norwegian Petroleum Directorate based on previous seismic data sets. If we now plot our data with this, you can see the increase in complexity that we picked up. So we see many more faults. We also see the faults that have previously been mapped. So this gives us confidence that our algorithm really works well. And we see much more complexity, just going back and forth. Once more, maybe. You can see that this area is, there are many more faults that have not been previously picked up. Yes, so we saw how we can identify where the faults are, but now we want to analyze them. And to do this, we need to go from this volume to a fault network. And we developed a toolbox that can do this. The basic idea is that you use any input data and you map the fault network as such, as a network. So as a graph that consists of nodes and edges connecting these nodes. It has complete freedom of the location of these nodes and the number of edges, so you can basically capture any arbitrary structure, and you can then, once you have captured the fault system, identify the fault as the nodes that are connected to one another. And you can then also analyze these faults, for instance, by picking up the strain along the nodes. So if we do this in our example, we have to go through a few processing steps. We have our fault probability map at a horizon extracted. We can nicely see the faults. Then we pick up the areas where we have the faults using a threshold, splits the data sets in ones and zeros again. We can then collapse the faults to a line, so we get a nice sharp network. And then on the next slide, you can see how the result looks once we have the faults extracted. So each line with the color corresponds to one fault with nodes connected to one another. So you can nicely see that it picks up nice coherent structures in here, and that you have a lot of complexity in these areas. So in these areas, you need to apply some rules how you split up these faults because they are initially connected. So once we have this network extracted, we can apply typical fault analyses, like we can measure the length of the faults. And you can see that there's quite a wide spread. So you have some really long faults in here. These are typical large-scale normal faults that are forming half-grams and rotated fault blocks. But you also have large areas where you have many more faults, but of shorter length. We can also calculate the orientation of these faults and see that you have this ongoing debate about extension directions in the North Sea. You can see that there's a wide spread of fault stripes, in particular varying in terms of areas. So it's not that you have the same strikes everywhere, but that you have distinct areas, domains where some fault strikes occur.
You have 11 minutes now.
Mm-hmm. And that you have almost like in the histogram, you have two main distributions in fault orientations. Yes, so we come to the end. Just to summarize, we learned why we should map fault systems. We learned how to analyze our seismic reflection data to highlight them, and then how to map them using graphs. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thanks a lot, Thilo. Yeah, finished only because I say it's 11 minutes. So there's time for a few questions. Just put them in the chat. Nick Molnar has one.
Hello, Thilo. Thanks for the talk. I have a question related to like the source of how you feed these models. You always start from the seismic reflection images, like from 2D, then you build this probability of where those faults are, then you create the 3D, and that's where you then create the fault network, if I'm right? Okay.
Yes. So you can also do the whole process in 3D. So the seismic volume is nothing else but a lot of 2D lines that you can look at in one direction or in another, in an arbitrary direction. They're really closely spaced. So you could also do a whole process in 3D. It's just at the time I didn't. It's a bit more tricky. It takes a lot more resources because you need to deal with much larger volumes of data. But there's no reason why you couldn't do this, and it should actually increase further the accuracy. Yeah.
You're right, and the second point will be because otherwise you would need to somehow correlate each of those like 2D lines, like which fault relates to each one. So you basically create the 3D point cloud or whatever you call it. And then in the top view, you run this fault network analysis later, right?
Yes, so it's two things. So the machine learning one you can do in 3D quite easily, and then you get to the same point that you have a volume that predicts sort of where the faults are. Probably even better. But the fault extraction workflow, yeah, you would probably again split it up piecewise, and then from each, I guess, slice, however you slice it, correlate it across and say how the faults then look in 3D. So this is I think a harder nut to crack. It's probably quite difficult. Yeah.
Thank you.
Suzanne has a question.
Yeah, this is really, I'm very intrigued. It's really impressive, this. So when you look at the seismic data and you have people interpret it, and as you know, like on rifted margins, there will be different interpretations depending on who does the interpretation, right? And there can be quite some debate because of the implications that has for how the margin would have evolved. So what is then the final answer? And do you think your method applying the deep learning. How does that fit in different interpretations that people are doing?
Yeah, this is a really good question. It's a bit of a different challenge. So in this study, the main challenge was that the data set was too big to be analyzed by one person. So I had to do this automatic. If you want to come to a consensus in terms of the type of interpretations, you would probably design this a bit differently in that. So the way it is now, it would just learn the pattern that the interpreter gives. So I've interpreted it like this, and in the data, then the model learns to recognize the pattern that I've given it in the training data. What you would like to do, I guess, is get different people to label the same data, capture the uncertainty, and then train an algorithm that can also predict a result and give the uncertainty of the prediction. So that you get into a point where you capture the uncertainty, but it's probably quite tricky because it's different types of uncertainty. So there's one question if you map a fault like slightly longer or less, but it's a totally different question if you map completely different structures. So the easiest thing would be if people would agree, and then we wouldn't need to do this. But I guess I'm not sure it's gonna be as useful for that question, because in a way the algorithm learns the pattern that you show it in the training data. So unless you show it a wide range of patterns.
Yeah, I mean, I agree. It would be really great if people would agree on their interpretation, but I don't think it's going to happen really soon. I have more questions, but I see that Andre has one too. So thanks a lot.
So Andre, you ask a question.
Oh, Susanne, if you have more questions, you just shoot. Thanks. I thought that was great. I have a question purely because I don't know anything about these techniques. And I know that in Groningen, where we have the induced seismicity, people have been using a method called end tracking and to identify the faults, and people have actually translated that into a fault roughness, because that is, of course, also important for earthquakes. How does your technique compare to the end tracking? And is there anything that you could do better?
There's definitely a lot of things that I can do better, like for example, going to 3D, and yeah, this is more like the first time this has really worked on a large data set and to a reasonable degree of accuracy. In terms of end tracking, it's a bit of a different approach. In end tracking, you calculate an attribute from the original seismic data that it's more hard-coded. So it basically says it's more related to algorithms like edge detection. So it looks at the seismic data, and from the data it computes an attribute that highlights where the discontinuities are. Here the approach is that you label some of the discontinuities, and you train then based on these a model to recognize the pattern to do it. So you don't have this labeling training phase with end tracking. It's more direct. In terms of the accuracy, I think this is the way to go, because the end tracking, you select a certain set of parameters which work on your data set in a certain area. So typically, if you have a fault that has a different appearance at different depths, this really breaks down, because you might be able to optimize your attribute for shallow depths where you have nice resolution, but at greater depths you don't see it at all. And the strength of this approach is that it can really capture the complexity and learn that at shallow depths it's discontinuities, and at greater depths you might see a fault plane reflection. So I think this is the way to go. When we compared it, it was also that you can get better results using machine learning than traditional seismic attributes like edge detection or end tracking. Yeah.
Great, thanks. Very clear.
Mm-hmm.